Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the side of Mount Silver Hills above Fairplay, Colorado. A lot of you have written in asking for constant updates on what's going on in Ukraine. I'll do my best, but things are kind of hard to parse right now because we're kind of in a waiting period. So, four big things. First of all, there have been a number of reports that the Ukrainians have been sending special forces across in the dozens, maybe into the low hundreds, from Kherson across the Dnieper River to wreak havoc behind enemy lines in southwestern Ukraine. Remember, this is an area that the Ukrainians had wanted to do a major thrust, but when the Kakova Dam was blown up by the Russians a couple months ago, that basically destroyed any possibility of using any infrastructure. So they're limited to doing small attacks like this. Normally, I would say doing assaults across a river with no supporting infrastructure would be suicide, but the Russians have clearly prioritized fighting further east, and it seems like the Ukrainians are operating with impunity. Not enough to do a major landing, not enough to bring in armor, but enough to be strategically significant. Where the Russians are focusing more is in the northeastern part of the front, specifically the province of Luhansk around the city of Kupiansk. I probably butchered that pronunciation, apologies. They're doing kind of a half-hearted assault simply to draw Ukrainian forces away from other areas, which brings us to the third part. In Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainians are doing their main thrust, and they have brought in several thousand troops with better equipment and better training that have been in NATO countries over the winter. They're trying to break through. It seems that they've penetrated the first of the three defensive lines, the mines. Now they're dealing with the anti-tank infrastructure and more formidable fortifications. And the Russians are trying to bleed off the support the Ukrainians are flooding into the area. Now remember, the Ukrainians don't actually have to break the lines. They just have to push far enough south to complicate the logistical picture for the Russians. The Ukrainians are proving that they can hit the Kerch Strait Bridge over and over and over. And as long as they're doing that, the Russians can't use Kerch for large-scale reinforcements or supply or fuel or ammo or anything. That forces the Russians to use the land bridge route west of Mariupol. Sorry for the wind. And that's what gets us into the area where the Ukrainians are trying to interdict. It would be nice to get to the Sea of Azov, certainly. That would cut it completely. But really all they have to do is to get within a few dozen miles in order to make the Russian position in Crimea untenable. Because if you can cut the northern and the southern supply lines at the same time, well, then Crimea is no longer a military asset for the Russians. It's an albatross around its neck that's going to cost it dearly. The only other thing I want to throw out is that there's been a lot of really bad economic data that's come out of Russia in the last few days. Interest rates going crazy, inflation going crazy, trade going crazy. It's difficult to pay too much attention to any of this because for all intensive purposes, Russia is now a wartime economy that is largely closed. And so most of the data that we would look to when we're dealing with a real country, a normal trading country, just isn't relevant for the Russians. For example, whatever is going up or down with the ruble doesn't matter because the ruble's not internationally traded. What's happening with trade doesn't matter because the Russians are literally flying planes full of gold to other countries to pay for things. That doesn't show up in the data. We just don't know. What we do know is that this is a statist economy that is run from the top and all dynamism is gone. Now, that allows Putin and the Kremlin to direct resources to things that they think they need done and to do so relatively quickly. But it also means that everything else is becoming very, very hollow. The Russian economy is not going to recover from this. That doesn't mean that there isn't a Russia. Russia, in a number of times throughout its history, has not had a functional economy. This is just the newest one. Okay, that's it from me. Everyone take care. Okay, it's next time. We're talking about U.S.-Saudi relations. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was in Saudi Arabia last week to see if they could hack out a new deal. Now, Saudi Arabia really matters, more so than many of America's true allies, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it sits on the holy sites of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and as so has the ability to reach out to Muslims wherever they happen to be with a significant message that is often taken seriously. And second, it's the world's largest oil exporter, giving just a huge amount of cash to pay for things and to manipulate the markets. There are three big things that Saudi Arabia has been critical in dealing with in the last 40 years. The first one is in the 1980s, a deal between then King Fahd and Ronald Reagan saw the Saudis open the taps in defiance of what was going on with OPEC and basically drove the Soviet Union out of business. By tanking oil prices, it triggered an economic war that the Russians, who were addicted to commodities exports income and were using it to support their empire throughout the world, simply couldn't compete with. So this massive expansion that we saw under Brezhnev, particularly across the developing world, had the Soviet Union subsidizing some of the world's poorest countries, and that couldn't be sustained when oil prices tanked. It was very effective. It also triggered the last period of strong economic growth that we have ever seen out of Europe and Japan, not to mention setting the groundwork for the economic activity that was required to generate the information boom here in the United States. Second, fresh off that success, Reagan again, with the Saudis, orchestrated the war in Afghanistan, basically building the Mujahideen, providing them with weapons and equipment and funding to fight the Soviets, which was, again, wildly successful because it turned what was a bit of a strategic adventure into a bleeding wound that the Soviet Union never recovered from. And then when the Soviet system fell and the Americans moved on, the Saudis discovered that the tools that they used for Afghanistan were applicable in other places. And so the Chechen wars happened. Now, they probably would have happened anyway, but the Saudis and the Emiratis and some of the other Gulf Arabs stepped in to provide financing and equipment and intelligence and recruiting for the international forces that eventually decamped to Chechnya and helped the Chechens in their first and their second wars. Now, you play this forward in today's environment, and things get very lively. The oil situation is obvious. The Russians are already crimped because of sanctions, and if the Saudis actually were to tank oil prices again, it wouldn't have much of an effect on the American economy because we're self-sufficient now. But it would absolutely crush the Russians' bottom line. Second, the Chechen scenario. It's entirely possible that there are other groups within Russia that don't enjoy being under the Russian thumb. Right now, the Chechens are fighting officially on the side of the Russians, but there are many factions within the Chechen system, and anything that was to break that up would force the Chechens to go home and fight for their own lands. There are also the Tatars, which exist not only in Russia proper, but also in Crimea. So you could easily have some underground wars that would greatly stress Russian operations and set the stage for a renewed Ukrainian push. Bottom line, Saudi Arabia, it's not that its natural position is under the American wing. It's not. It's its own power center. But to think that something like a hacked-up journalist and a policy on electric vehicles is going to get in the way of grand geopolitics in an environment when all the major players are already in motion, that's a little naive. Saudi Arabia is a free agent, and there are any number of things that the Americans and the Saudis can provide for one another if they can get past some of the ugly politics of the last few years. And if history shows us anything, they've done it before. All right, that's it. Take care.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Mosquito Western Traverse on Horseshoe Peak. Over here, we've got the Collegiate Peaks for some of my favorite hiking in Colorado. Today, we're going to talk about Vietnam. Joe Biden has announced that he'll be going to Vietnam soon. It'll probably be in September when he's already got a series of Asian summits planned. This trip was supposed to happen a few months ago, but it got canceled because of debt ceiling talks. Anyway, Vietnam is one of the up-and-coming allies in the American portfolio and a major regional power in its own right, unique among many of the advancing developing countries. Vietnam actually has a healthy demography, so even if it keeps aging at its current rate, it's still going to be a major regional power 30, 40, 50 years from now. But more to the point is they've got the attitude and the positioning that is necessary. Now, for those of you who remember your history, we had the Vietnam War, where northern Vietnam and southern Vietnam duked it out with the Russians backing the north and the Americans backing the south. Ultimately, the South lost. The whole place was integrated into one, but integration is a work in progress. One of the things to keep in mind about Vietnam is it's basically a barbell, with about 45% of the population in the south around Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City now, about 45% in the north around Hanoi, and then there's a long, thin, rugged coastal strip in between that has almost nobody. That makes the concept
of political unification, even with the military occupation somewhat difficult. And this is something that the Vietnamese are going to be working on for the better part of the next century. That assumes that there's no unrest. That assumes there's no additional civil war. Not that I think that either of those are on the horizon, but you can never guarantee it when you've got populations so separated. One thing all Vietnamese agree on is that the Chinese are awful. There's this park of monuments in Hanoi where they commemorate all of their fallen in their war, kind of like what the United States does on the Mall in D.C. And there's a small, roughly waist-high one commemorating the 20 years of the American-Vietnamese conflict. And then there's a taller one that's taller than me, commemorating the 200 years conflict between the Vietnamese and the French, who were the colonial power there. And then there's a 2-story monument that commemorates the 2,000 years of warfare with the Han Chinese. So there's no love lost here. And if you are looking for a strategic partner, it's hard to get better than Vietnam because the demographics are good. They're a great trade partner, very hardworking. Their educational system is probably the best for their peer class. 40% of their college graduates are STEM graduates, if you can believe that. They're attempting to jump over China technologically, and because of the partnerships they've been able to work out with American educational and manufacturing institutions, they have a reasonable chance of pulling that off sometime at the end of this decade or early next. So this is kind of the partner that you want. They also have excellent relations with the Japanese and the Thais and the Australians. So they're slotting in to the American alliance network surprisingly well. There's just really one problem. There's nothing about Vietnam that is democratic. It's basically got a Chinese-style Politburo and top-down leadership from Hanoi. And considering that they're in the midst of a cultural unification process, I really don't see Hanoi loosening that grip. And that's going to keep Vietnam out of the American inner circle of allies. But for everything else, it's a great match. All right, I gotta go put on a bigger hat. It's a little chilly.